Can you elaborate on that mission statement and what do you mean by harnessing our innate healing potential?
Perfect segue, because clinical hypnosis is just one example of ways that we can change our relationship with our bodies and have a top-down control on how our body functions. In the normal state, our bodies are in this, what we call state of homeostasis, of equilibrium or of balance. But for any number of reasons, whether they be external, like the environment, which is probably most often the cause, versus internal things like genetic issues that we don't have as much control over, this homeostatic equilibrium gets disrupted. And that's usually where disease comes out. I mean, for example, I live in San Francisco. We had the last coal-fired power plant shut down in the Bayshore neighborhood a number of years ago. But there were women having preterm births, and these kids were having to go to the NICU, the neonatal ICU, so it's the ICU for little babies. And it's like, this is a classic example where there's an environmental exposure in mom that we believe is causing their uterus to have some abnormal relationship with the placenta and the fetus, causing this baby to come out early and the baby to have health problems, requiring monitoring in the neonatal ICU. So there's some disruption of what would otherwise presumably be a normal child rearing process in ways that are far beyond our understanding, but we have an association that we can at least use as a base point to study. The easy thing there is that we'll just shut down the coal-fired power plant. They did that. The number of neonatal ICU admissions plummeted. Now, obviously, this is association, not causality. You can't really, do a randomized trial of doing this. But the point here is that we can control our body to restore its homeostasis by removing the insults. They're typically from the environment, right? So when you have a working body, it can usually restore its own homeostasis once you've removed the offending trigger. In that case, it was the coal-fired power plants, and who knows what toxins are coming out of the chutes there. We can augment this sometimes with most often mind-body paradigms that allow us to reduce other insults that we're adding to external insults. The most common internal insult is probably not genetics. It's probably sources of stress, right? Because once again, the mind-body connection. And if anyone doubts mind-body connection, there are, I don't want to say an infinite number of examples. There's so many examples. Just the other day, one of the people in the operating room was just complaining about how every time she hears a baby cry in the supermarket, how she just had a baby, how she feels her milk coming out. And it's just like, I was like, wow, I hadn't even thought about that example of the mind-body connection. Any pregnant woman or, woman who's nurse fed will attest to that. How an auditory stimulus from outside is affecting our brain in a way that's sending hormones out of our hypothalamus area to eventually reach breast tissue, right? So, like I said, just one of an incredibly high number of demonstrable examples. So anyways, when I'm talking about harnessing the inner healing potential, it's how do we unblock the internal blocks we put to our body regaining its homeostasis? They often come in the form of stress that exhibit or manifest as mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, addiction, PTSD, because those all have a very tangible effect on our body.
Yeah, I like your, I don't know if it's medical terms, but I like when you use the word, you just got to remove the insults, right? So I like that phrasing. And a useful concept for the listeners who want to dive more into the idea of the person and environment, like the epigenetics, right? It's about the change of DNA expressions through environmental feedback that is not part of your genetic sets. It's called the health determinants. It's basically saying some of the qualifiers, some of the potential contributing factors to determining your future health outcome. So that's what Anthony is in the realm of talking about. And for anyone who want to learn more about this, discover more about this, just look up health determinants.
So let me ask you a question. So because except what you just said, so powerful. Have you heard of the broken heart syndrome?
I have not.
Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. The name comes from Takotsubo. So it's maybe you know how taco is octopus. It's called that because the heart balloons into one of these octopus traps, like a giant big spherical thing. And it happens, as far as we can tell, after cases of extreme stress. So this is a common layperson example. This can be lethal. Rarely is it lethal. Fortunately, the heart can return back to normal function without going into permanent heart failure. If you remove the offending insult, usually it's some sort of psychogenic insult. Maybe the death of a loved one, or it could be a stress after a surgery. Physical and mental stresses are really one and the same. And it's just one layperson example that shows how powerful an external insult can be on the body and how the body can recover once, like you said, that insult is removed. Letting the body do what it does best, letting it engage in its own innate healing potential by you getting out of the way.
Yeah, so I have a next follow-up question ready for you, and this is right on the train. So one of my favorite content of yours through my research is titled How Your Body Reveals Secrets Under Anesthesia, right? And then, of course, there's a book called Body Keeps a Score. That's the whole idea of that, how your body takes a catalog and accounting of every tour, stresses, the stress you go through in life. But can you demonstrate and just talk to us about like how our bodies actually keep score of everything and the way they are revealed under a certain condition such as anesthesia?
So the truth serum, have you heard of this truth serum thing? It's all over the internet. People want to know, you know? Is this like what the FBI uses when it's interrogating prisoners? Right? So sadly, once again, not quite as sexy as you can just give it a medication and people will blurt out everything. In some cases, yeah. You know, I can't share the number of ridiculous things that people have told me that are probably true. They probably never told anyone before, but here they are blurting them out to a more or less stranger in a room of more or less strangers. So there's some element of just sheer disinhibition. Like if you get really drunk at a bar, you have decreased frontal cortex activity. And you're going to say stuff you didn't mean to that might be revealing of how you truly feel. We all know what we're talking about here. Now, at a deeper level, the body itself has some scorecard. And we don't really know how this works, but it's literally like the body closing in on itself when it has unprocessed traumas, unprocessed triggers of depression or anxiety that aren't manifest if the body and mind aren't ready to let it out. Under anesthesia, it's not a one-to-one, but certainly there's a correlation that I and many other practitioners have noticed that when patients start to descend into different levels of consciousness, their brain is disinhibited, their body is disinhibited. And for different reasons that we can hypothesize about, the body reacts unusually to anesthesia medications when it has certain traumas on board. Now, one relatively easy reason to understand why is that people with, for example, severe anxiety, severe depression, other mental health conditions are more likely to use drugs of abuse. Anesthesia and drugs of abuse totally do not mix well, and you can absolutely tell somebody who abuses any of these illicit drugs, their bodies manifest this when they're asleep under anesthesia. They don't have, it's not a true serum effect here. Their heart rate, their lungs, their vocal cords, things act in ways that are like, something is very unusual about this person's physiology. So very much their body manifesting it. A deeper level is that, people with depression and anxiety, even if they're not abusing drugs, they might still be taking neuropsychiatric drugs, like antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications. This also comes through under anesthesia in the operating room because our anesthetic medications also interact with those medications in ways that we can semi-reliably tell when they're asleep. Once again, they're not telling us anything. Their body is telling us these things. And then you have what I view as the deepest state, where even if somebody is entirely unmedicated, but severely depressed, hyper anxious, maybe holding on to trauma for a long time, are their bodies also going to manifest this when they're asleep under anesthesia? Probably the least studied of all, because we don't really, in Western society, subscribe to this hypothesis of the scorecard of the body, but it certainly appears that they also have exaggerated responses, not only from higher dose requirements, and this has been studied in peer-reviewed literature. So, for example, somebody who's hyper anxious, they just have so many cogs turning in their brain, they need more anesthesia to fall asleep, sometimes to stay asleep. And then when they wake up from anesthesia, they also, in my experience, this has probably been a little bit less studied, but still some evidence out there to suggest that they tend to wake up with more emergence delirium, meaning that they're just completely unconsolable, even though they're not remembering. They're kind of like in this in-between state of conscious unconscious. Their body is just reacting in ways that are very exaggerated. Arms flailing, hitting, screaming, crying, doing all sorts of things that they don't remember. They will not remember, but is still a window into their subconscious state.
Man, that's really fascinating, because just the fact that our psychophysiological response would almost tell on its own without us being responsible for telling. It's almost like our body snitching on us, right?
Yeah, it is.
Under the most purest state. Yeah, that's really cool.